Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you guys have been recommending to me for quite some time now that I take a look at the YouTube channel Eastory. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. So that's what we're going to do today, and we're going to take a look at a couple of videos here on a topic I know a little something about for the first time diving into a new channel. So we're going to look at World War II, the Western Front, 1944 to 45. I guess it probably begins here with June 1944 with the Normandy invasion. So we'll take a look at that. I'm going to be posting a vote over on Patreon. We haven't done one of these for a while, to get your feedback on what my next series should be. So if you are a patron or you'd like to consider being a patron, go ahead and head over there and you can cast your vote on what you'd like to see next. Still feeling a little sick, so I don't know how much I'll be interrupting this video to talk, but thankfully my COVID test did come back negative, so it's not that, just a bad cold. So here we go, let's dive in.
June 1944. The Allies had been long preparing to launch an invasion of German-held Europe, and now all was finally ready. For the invasion, they had gathered more than 2 million men. The Germans could only muster a force of less than half the size.
And it's important to note, too, that while initially the Germans are going to have the advantage, because obviously the Allies can't land 2.4 million men in the first wave. We're talking about maybe 100,000, something like that, initially in the first couple of waves, but then, more and more throughout the next couple of days. But the big difference here, of course, a couple of things. Number one is complete air supremacy for the Allies. I mean, they're just dominating the skies at this point over Western Europe. And the training level. I can't speak to all the British soldiers and some of the others, but the vast majority of these Allied troops have been either in combat for the last 2 years or have been training for a good 2 years. You've got like the 82nd Airborne Division, the 1st Infantry Division for the United States who have been in combat before. You've got new troops like the 101st Airborne Division who have not been in combat but have been training for the better part of 2 years. Most of these German soldiers are fairly new recruits. They're conscripts. They're guys that have only been trained for a couple of weeks and then rushed to the front lines. There's a big difference in the training and the leadership level of these two sides.
The Allies gave the Germans the impression that they were to land on the eastern part of the channel, and the Germans deployed their strongest forces there.
And, they had done, we've talked about this before, there was a whole lot of counterintelligence going on. The Allies had a masterful scheme of convincing the Germans that this is where it was going to come. And there were a lot of reasons why the Germans figured it would either come at Calais or at Normandy. Calais made sense because of how close it was. You can stand there and see, if you're standing in England, you can see France from there and vice versa. It's by far the shortest point. So there were a lot of reasons why it made sense, especially when the Germans got convinced that Patton's fictitious army was gathering here for that invasion.
This lessened the German strength in Normandy, where the Allies actually intended to land. Most of the Allies landed with little difficulty.
And that's something else we don't talk a lot about. The vast majority of the landings at Normandy did not face a ton of opposition. There were sectors of Omaha Beach, for example, that were brutal, that you see in things like Saving Private Ryan, but most of the landings at Normandy did not look like Saving Private Ryan. There were just certain areas, and this is a huge area. I mean, we're talking about, I think, 60 miles from one end to the other. This is not, a beach here, a beach there, where you can see each beach from the other ones. This is a big area, and they're divided by rivers, and so you've got to hurry up and take inland. And when you start looking at the map, you start seeing where the key points are. Caen, for example. Carentan becomes huge because that is the link-up point between the two American beaches, Utah over here and Omaha over here. So that's why that becomes a big, strong point. Cherbourg is going to become important because that's a deep water port that the Allies have to have.
In the next few days, they completed their second objective by linking up all of their forces in the area. The Germans concentrated most of their reserves to the eastern section to cover the way into central France.
It makes sense to concentrate your forces here. You figure, okay, they've already got this far. They're probably going to take Cherbourg. Let's cut them off and keep them up in the Cotentin Peninsula. There was a lot of debate that went on between the German high command about the most effective strategy for when the Allied invasion came. Some people thought we've got to hold them at the beach. If they get off the beach, we're done. Other people said, you know what, it's not about the beach. It's about counterattacking once they've got there and then pushing them back. And, obviously we know what happened.
The western sector did not get enough reinforcements. The Americans broke the German line and cut off their forces around Cherbourg. The Germans pulled back and attempted to dig in around the town. But the American pursuit did not give them the time to do that, and they were forced to surrender, leaving...
There's a difference there between how the Americans pursued the Germans into Cherbourg and how the Germans pursued the British at Dunkirk a few years earlier. Didn't give them time, and there was probably a lesson that was learned there in that.
Leaving Cherbourg in Allied hands. By that time, the Germans had lost the opportunity to push the Allies into the sea. They had deployed only several 100,000 soldiers, while the Allies had already landed 1 million men. During the next month, the Allies launched several offensives. In the eastern sector, the British pushed the Germans back and gained control of Caen and the terrain around it. At the same time, the Americans crossed through difficult terrain and reached ground more favorable for starting a larger offensive.
So it's important to note here, if you look at that, we're talking a month and a half after Normandy. In the grand scheme of things, they haven't pushed that far. They've really just got the Cotentin Peninsula. They've gotten a little bit inland. They've taken Caen. The main thing, though, is they've got room to work. They laid a cable across in the days after the Normandy landing to start pumping oil across. They had these mulberry artificial harbors they created until they could take Cherbourg. Now they've got a place that they can move men and material in and start preparing for the big offensive. And it's interesting that a month and a half to take all of this, but watch how quickly they break out in the coming weeks.
By late July, the Allies had achieved a strong superiority and were ready to launch the breakout. The strong German force in the east kept the Allied attacks at bay, but in the west, the Americans were able to break through the German lines. The German divisions in the north attempted to escape the encirclement, but several of them were destroyed. The Germans now had little strength to stop the Allies, and the Americans were soon in the open country.
So that is just, a week and a half? They've doubled the amount of territory they've taken in the first 6 weeks, and it's about to get a whole lot crazier.
With the front broken and their troops outnumbered, the reasonable decision for the Germans might have been to pull their forces back. However, they chose to counterattack and close the breakout forces' supply route. The Allies originally planned to concentrate on capturing the ports in Brittany, but when they realized that the main German force was not going to retreat, they turned their troops east to try to encircle the Germans. The German attempts to cut off the Allied breakout had failed. They were able to contain the Anglo-Canadian attack from the north, but when the Americans approached from the south, the Germans had no choice but to retreat to avoid an encirclement.
And this was brilliant by the Allies to spread out, to get in and around them. They've got like a 5-to-1 advantage in numbers right now. Use that advantage. If you can destroy large parts of the army, you make your job a lot easier marching on Paris.
The withdrawal was delayed up to the last moment, and this would cost them dearly in the following weeks. A lot of the German mobile forces were able to escape the encirclement, but most of their infantry divisions were cut off and forced to surrender. The remaining German troops now attempted to establish a new defensive line on the Seine River. However, the Allies had anticipated that. As they were closing the pocket, they had already sent their troops towards the Seine.
And it's important to note, too, that while this was all going on, there were also Allied troops that landed in southeastern France on the Mediterranean and started pushing up that way. So the Germans just have fronts to try and contain everywhere. They've also got to deal with the Soviet army marching in from the east. They're just collapsing everywhere. They don't have the manpower to hold.
It pushed away weak German resistance and established a bridgehead over the river. As a result, the Germans were unable to easily access the eastern part of the river. The Allies used this fact and raced east themselves. They established their positions along the eastern Seine before the Germans could dispatch significant forces to counter them. The German garrison in Paris was left isolated and surrendered to the Allies on the 25th of August. The Allies had gained the upper hand in France, and they had now established more ambitious objectives. One was to capture the main German industrial area in the Ruhr. Occupying it would severely reduce the German ability to maintain their war effort. The second objective...
So think about this for a second. Okay, it took them 6 weeks just to get this little area right here. 6 weeks, that's all they had. In the next 6 weeks after that, they take all of this territory. Now, all of a sudden, they're thinking, okay, let's go for the Ruhr. This is the industrial heartland of the German Empire right here. If we take this, we're in good shape. And of course, this is where they start to get the plans for Market Garden, which will move them right up in through here and into the Ruhr.
The objective was securing the channel ports in order to improve the Allied supply situation. In their way, there were several man-made and natural obstacles which the Germans could use for defense. The Allies' first move was an attack north into Belgium, which would move them closer to both of their objectives. The main goal of the Germans was to establish a new defensive line in the north and extract their forces intact from southern France. They deployed most of their available reserves to keep open the path of retreat. In the north, the Germans were constructing a new defensive line behind the Seine.
So basically, the defensive line they're drawing is similar to the line of World War I. If you look at maps of the Western Front once they settled into trench warfare, it was kind of along this area here.
They attempted to hold the Seine as long as possible and then pull their troops back to the new line. However, this could not be done. The Germans had not had the time to cover the eastern section of the river. The Allies crossed the river and advanced quickly northwards towards the main German defenses. Then the Allies breached the German line in the center and the Germans had no hope of holding them back. The Germans began belatedly withdrawing to their main defenses, but by that time the Allies had already advanced beyond them.
And so one of the things that we've talked about when we talk about the airborne divisions, the Allies have this incredible resource in these airborne divisions, and they kept planning drops for the airborne divisions in different places and to drop behind enemy lines and disrupt things, secure bridges over some of these key rivers, things like that. And what was happening was they were moving so fast that every time they would take the time to plan, because you got a lot of planning involved in this. To plan an airborne mission, to give them their targets, to let them know what their job was, to figure out the drop zones. By the time they were ready to run the mission, the Allied forces on the ground had already overrun that drop zone and they were back to square one. And this happened multiple times. And that's one of the things that goes into the decision to approve Monty's Market Garden plan was, we've got these airborne troops, so we've got to do something with them. And so they came up with this idea of Market Garden.
Germans retreated in full speed to avoid being trapped, but they were unable to save all of their forces. The Allies linked up and cut off part of their troops. The Allies continued their advance north and trapped even more Germans near the sea. The remaining Germans continued a fast withdrawal to the east. They were able to successfully reach their new defensive positions on the Siegfried Line before the Allies. With Germany itself coming under threat, the Germans would deploy most of their reserve units to the front in the following weeks. The Allies now had to choose whether to concentrate on clearing the ports or the Ruhr. They decided to go for the Ruhr. There were two main obstacles separating the Allies from the Ruhr: the Siegfried Line and the Rhine River. The Allies decided to cross them by moving north in a single operation called Market Garden. In this way, they would not have to deal with the Siegfried Line and they would be able to cross the Rhine River with a surprise airborne assault.
So Patton is down here with his men, and he's arguing vehemently that he can break through the Siegfried Line, that there's not much resistance there. Just give me the supplies, give me the ammo, give me the gasoline that I need for my tanks. We'll break through the Siegfried Line, we'll be into Germany, and this thing will be done. Monty, on the other hand, Field Marshal Montgomery, is arguing for a thrust with the airborne divisions. You drop the British airborne, the American airborne, you secure all of these bridgeheads on this road leading up through Eindhoven up to Arnhem, and you're across the Rhine River and you're into Germany. And they darn near did it. And if you've watched everything that's happened, how quickly they've been moving, and how the Germans have just collapsed, you can start to understand why it would seem like this is a chance worth taking. It's easy when you just look at Market Garden and you look in hindsight at what happened. You can judge it and say this was stupid, it was a big mistake. But when you take in everything that has happened and you take in the consideration of using the airborne divisions, it starts to make a little more sense as a gamble worth taking.
The paratroopers would capture the two bridges over the Rhine River at Arnhem and Nijmegen. Then with the aid of other airborne drops, the ground forces would quickly link up with them and cross the Rhine in strength. The paratroopers landed, but they were unable to capture either of the bridges. With the help of the ground forces, the Allies were able to take the bridge at Nijmegen, but by that time the Germans had fully secured Arnhem. The path over the Rhine was closed, and the Allies were only able to rescue the surviving paratroopers.
Yeah, so the British 1st Airborne just get slaughtered, and very few of them make it back. And it was that last bridge, that's why they always say a bridge too far. It was the bridge over into Arnhem that they considered to be the bridge too far. Now, this did not work out, but the Allies did continue to hold this territory. Eventually, they send the 101st up here, closer to Arnhem. This is where we see in Band of Brothers the things that happened in October of 1944. Some of that stuff, and eventually there is continued fighting here for a couple of months.
During the following weeks, the German reserves reached the front. The Allies needed much more strength to breach the German defenses. In order to build it up, it was necessary to recover the Channel ports and improve the supply situation. The Allies were able to capture the port of Antwerp with its docking facilities intact. However, they had then concentrated on Market Garden and had not cleared out the approaches to Antwerp, which prevented its use. The Allies first captured Boulogne and Calais, but their facilities turned out to be so damaged by the Germans that they needed to open Antwerp. By that time, the Germans had heavily fortified the Antwerp approaches. The Allies now had to launch a difficult assault, and it took them more than a month to dislodge the German defenders. Clearing the water of mines took several more weeks, and only by late November the Allies had fully restored their supply flow. During that time, their other forces were fighting on the German border.
And isn't it interesting that Dunkirk is still in German hands? So much like with the Allies, how they were able to hang on to it, now the Germans are hanging on to Dunkirk. But you see the situation here by this point. Germany's right here. It's easy to feel like, okay, we're going to sit back. We're not going to take Germany by Christmas, kind of get lulled into a false sense of security. And this creates the opportunity for that last big push in what we call the Battle of the Bulge. But I'm guessing that's not going to be in this video. I guess we'll see.
In September, the Allies attempted to breach the German defenses in 3 locations, with the Operation Market Garden and with the attacks in the north and south of the Ardennes. In the north, they had to cross the Siegfried Line. The Allies made progress through the first line of defense, but the arrival of German emergency reinforcements halted them on the second line. After waiting to replenish their supplies, the Allies cut off Aachen from the German lines and captured the town. They then began building up supplies for another attack. In the south, the events played out somewhat differently. The Germans had deployed their early reinforcements to this sector and set up their defenses on the Moselle River in France. The Allies reached the area in early September, and when they had arrived in force, they broke into the German line and captured the town of Nancy. Then the Allies had to stop the offensive for 2 months to improve their supply situation.
And that goes back to not having Antwerp, not having some of these ports. They were pushing the Germans, but they ran out of supplies, ran out of gasoline, couldn't keep going, had to stop and wait until they had the supplies to push forward. That's the only thing stopping them from winning the war earlier.
The Allied forces in the southernmost part of the front reached the area from southern France. After the Allies had broken out of Normandy, their forces landed in the south on the 15th of August. By that time, the Germans in the south had already sent a lot of their forces to Normandy and didn't have the strength to resist the Allies. They began to retreat north to the German border. The Americans began to pursue the retreating Germans. They moved north and attempted to cut the German path of retreat, but their forces were too weak to do that, and they were only able to inflict some casualties. The French forces arrived on the shore and moved to secure the major harbors.
Now you keep seeing all these POWs that are being captured by the Allies. What happened to all of them? Well, it's pretty interesting to look at maps that show you all the POW camps in the United States. I mean, there were hundreds of camps in the U.S. Camp Toccoa, where the men of Easy Company trained, got turned into a POW camp. They were holding German prisoners there. I think nearly all 50 states had POW camps.
Morale of the German garrisons was low, and they fell after only brief resistance. The French prepared to join the pursuit on the American western flank. The American forces were continuing the pursuit, but the Germans used their tank division to blunt their advances and were able to continue their retreat. Soon, the Germans made a stand to allow the German forces retreating from southwestern France to catch up. They were able to hold the line for some time, but then were compelled to continue their retreat. At that time, the Allied forces coming from southern France linked up with those coming from Normandy. The Germans finished their retreat. During the pursuit, they had lost around half of their troops, but they had brought out enough soldiers to man their section of the main German defensive line. By early November of 1944, the Allies were about to launch a major offensive into Germany along the whole front. The end of the war had never seemed so close, but what they did not know was that Germany had used the pause in fighting to prepare its own offensive.
And that would be the Battle of the Bulge, which we will talk about when we look at the next part of his video series. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think about this channel? What do you think about what we talked about today? What would you add to what I've discussed? Use the comment section below. Please don't forget to hit that like button. Thank you so much to all of our patrons, all of our members here on YouTube. And head on over to Patreon if you're a patron and vote about the upcoming series. Thanks for watching.